that I was working in my company as an entrepreneur. And so when I moved, when I came into this program and, I was back in my studio, I started with the theme that was the closest to me at that point, which was entrepreneurship. Um, so these pieces are actually fairly large. You can see they're about like 200 and plus centimeters. Some of them were about 7 feet high. Um, I'd done smaller pieces before, but during this program, I had this mentor, and perhaps for people who are from South Asia, would know Salima Hashmi. She's a legend, back home. And she was one of my mentors, and she kept saying, okay, you've worked small or medium all your life. You need, do something different, do something different. And so I got really frustrated one day, and then I pinned up like this giant like paper on my studio wall, and then I started drawing, and I started drawing with a material I'd never used before, which was pastels. And I started drawing these unicorns because in the startup community, which I've been a part of for about 7 years, everybody wanted to be a unicorn. Unicorn in entrepreneurship is a business that's being valued at $1 billion plus. And for me, it just seems so ridiculous. And I mean, the startup community is very male dominated also. And for me, like it just seems so ridiculous that they're all these mostly men, and they're all aspiring for their businesses and for themselves to be unicorns. And a unicorn actually it doesn't even exist. It's a mythical animal. And so why aspire to be something that does not exist? The only form that it really exists in is in children's toys, like stuffies that they sleep with. And so the whole like strangeness, I found the whole like situation just a little a little ridiculous. And it was also like one day I would see a business, getting a lot of investment. And then the other day it would just kind of collapse. And so all of those things were kind of going, through my mind. And so I made this series that was very large. Also, it seemed like the right thing to do to make these larger than life with these businesses that aimed or aspired to be larger than life with their larger than life like conversations and aspirations. Um, and so while I was working on this, around the same time, I started with this series. And I did a lot of those unicorns, and then I kind of got that out of my system, and now I'm really firmly back in the studio. And so now I'm thinking about like the next project. And I've always been obsessed like throughout my career as an artist with the human body. And even in the unicorn pieces, I feel like the body is very, very present. It's just different, materially different. Like instead of flesh, they're balloons. Um, so from that, I came and I rested on this series where I see the body as a place or a thing that records your DNA, records memories. Like, they'll say, oh, you have your grandfather's nose or you have your mother's eyes. And it's this almost like this topography that you share with all of your ancestors. And I mean, the immediate ones are very clear. Yeah, I have my mother's eyes. But then where is my nose from? And I found this like, I found I found it incredible. Like, how far has my nose traveled? Um, and so I started to make these also fairly large pastel drawings um, of different like parts of the body. I made a few. I was obsessing a little bit over the nose initially, mostly because being on Instagram and being in Dubai, and you see a lot of similar noses. And so for me, who was like thinking about how far has my nose traveled, or where like which body part is being inherited from which ancestor, it seems strange that so many people would have the same kind of nose. And well, it's also the most altered like body part, I think. Most so I mean, like you'll see like a cut paste of like a nose that's sort of is in fashion, especially on Instagram. And I found that so strange. Like, you're surgically altering this. I was also thinking of the nose as this place that gives you a direct connection to your brain. Um, Around the same time, I was diagnosed with like a slight, like there's a membrane that sort of holds your is around your brain, and had a slight hole in it, and so I was leaking brain fluid, like cranial fluid, through my nose. And the way that they diagnose you is they actually stick something up your nose, and they can actually see, like in my mind, it was like, oh my God, are you actually like seeing my brain? So is the nose like a direct connection to the brain? And so it just seems so strange that there's this beautiful thing that gives you access to the most incredible part of the human body, which is your brain, and all we are thinking of doing is shaving this connection off and altering it and making it smaller and smaller. And then I was also thinking of things like, the nose just keeps growing larger and larger the older you get. And I was like, of course it does, because you get wiser the older you get, and so that like access to your brain has to get larger anyway. So I was thinking of yeah, they're a bit tongue in cheek, but I was thinking of like the outside world and the inside world at this point, like access from the outside to the inside of you. Um, and so it was around this time, and this is from the same series, that I shifted focus to the mouth. And at this time, I was fully thinking about portals, like, the nose being a portal to the brain, or the mouth, which I'd started to obsess about. Um, I I I thought it was incredible because it's like the most complete point of access to our own interior geography. So whatever we place into the mouth and send it through this threshold, it enters another world entirely. And we know so little about the inside world, but we just know that something goes in. But what comes out of the mouth is something else entirely. And it's so extraordinary. It's like things like words and songs, and like words of persuasion and declarations of love and war, and these things are so powerful. And so for me, the mouth became this point through which our inner world speaks outward. And so this led me to the work that I'm currently doing. So I'm skipping over like a few years, because I did, I worked on this series for a while, and there were a couple of like other smaller projects that I did, but I'm gonna talk about the work that I'm doing right now. And I think it's finished, but I'm not 100% sure. I think I'm about 90% sure that it's finished. But I wanted to show it today because it's a project that's very close to my heart. And so you'll see that the mouth has remained over like the last like few years, thinking about portals again. Um, and I started this series about a year and a half ago. And it's very small. And so from the very large, I'm going very, very small. And what I've noticed is that when you go very large, the way that you work is very different. The materials, of course, that you choose are different, but the way that you work is different. You're going up a stepping stool, and you're coming down a stepping stool. Your work is pinned on a wall, so you're a little detached from the work. At least for me, I was facing the work. Detached perhaps is the wrong word, but I was facing the work. I was confronting it. Um, and I also used my whole body to work, just because I had to, because things were so high and then they were so low. Um, and for me, it was a challenge, how big can I go? And then how small can I go? And so I've gone progressively smaller, just a little bit bigger than a postcard. Um, and and with and they're a little like mixed media series. And in this series, I'm thinking of landscapes again, but not outwards, like of the human body, but I've gone inwards. So I'm toying with the idea of the human psyche as a landscape instead, because the human landscape is one that's made up of memory and emotion. And and I'm sort of in the series, I'm going inside, and I'm trying to recognize the way that our experiences shape the way that we are as human beings. and the way that we interact with the world and respond to the present world. Um, we have these experiences and then we internalize them into a way in which we move into the world currently. And so I'm interested in that. Um, and so this is like a journey of my own internal landscape, and I guess in an attempt to like understand it or decode it. So yeah, so the work is a mapping, but like I said, it's also an attempt to understand why, like also this particular route was taken. So if I've gone through a specific series of events in my life and experienced certain things, but then why did that change me in the way that it changed me to make me the person that I am today? Um, and so there's a lot of unpacking of childhood. Um, and so growing up, and I'm from Pakistan, and so growing up was initially slowly and then intensely tied to fear. I think growing up, I was also taught to distrust before trust and to always be on guard. Um, there was a lot of like watching over my shoulder, a lot of surveillance. Initially it was surveillance of like the male gaze. So cover yourself up, cover up your topography or your body so much that it is no longer recognizable. And then the surveillance sort of turned into like security situation surveillance. And you'll see within the series, there's the mouth, and then you'll see a bunch of eyes as it progresses. So the series actually is fairly big. It's about 51 pieces so far. And it's a narrative. So it's an unbound book and it has a beginning and a middle and an end. So somewhere in the middle, I start to speak about surveillance, and that's where you see this eye. And this eye is all my mother's eye, because my mother was also somebody who was always watching me. And so in a way, it was a surveillance of love, um, along with all other sorts of surveillance. Um, and so in in this like in the works with the eyes in them, I actually took lots and lots of photographs of my mother, and I cut out all of her eyes, and I was using her eyes for the work. Um, and then so I ended up with like this mountain of photographs of my mom, and she had no eyes. And some part of me kind of felt a little disturbed, but it also felt a bit of relief because there was no more watching. Um, and so in the work, when I started to make so many eyes, I started to realize that I was also feeling a kind of uneasy. And so I wanted to stop the eyes. And I didn't know what to do. And so I decided I'm gonna maybe cover them up with flesh, and then um, put like thread in them that look like hair. So something to stop the surveillance. Um, and so I think like as I'm taking to the work, I just want to highlight that for me, at least for me, the pieces are or they do resemble landscapes. It's not really an actual place, but it is, I hope, recognizably a landscape. Um, Something that's universally familiar but gone slightly awry. So you recognize it from a distance and be like, yep. But you get a little closer and there's something sinister about it, or something just not right about it, makes you feel uneasy. Um, and the materials that I've used in this series, which I want to just like touch on briefly because that's something that I've never done before, is a lot of the materials that I'm using are I'm making myself. So I like the work on the right, for example, that's onion and beetroot dye myself. A lot of like the inks that you'll see and the color that you see, I'm either using natural pigments or I'm creating the inks myself at home, buying like different sorts. And there's like this whole like few months in the middle where I was going and like foraging for like things, whether if I was back in Pakistan, I was foraging for different fruit. In Dubai, I would pick up everything from like cigarette butts to like all sorts of different things. And I think I needed to do this because, again, if the work is about memory and experience, then there's something about how a how a natural um, how a natural like ink travels across the surface of the paper. It's almost like it's recording its own experiences. It does things that I think store-bought ink or acrylics don't do. And for me, it was really lovely because it was like, okay, fine, so you leave your own memory on the paper while I'm leaving my memory on the paper. And so it was just worked out really beautifully for us, both of us. Um, so through this narrative, I have there is a protagonist that's journeying it and mapping it. And this protagonist has a fluid, like humanoid form. And I create this figure from parts of my own body. Um, like there are little fragments that I'll photograph or I'll draw and then I'll stitch them together um, to create my heroine. And for me, it makes sense to have my outer scape travel my inner, um, just because the body again is so important. Every one of these experiences and memories that I'm talking about was experienced through the body. The body is our first point of contact for any experience that we have. And so, and I also have a background as in classical dance. And so for me, it was very, very important that the body be used. Um, um, but then along with my stitched together protagonist, you'll also see children, two little children through this work as you progress through the narrative. Um, when I started this project, my son was around 3 or 4 years old. And I think one of the reasons why I started this project in the first place and why I wanted to revisit this internal landscape in the first place in order to understand it, and perhaps overcome it, was because I did not want my narrative to work its way into his narrative or my scars to be inherited by him. And so it became really important that I try and figure out, just try and figure out, Um, and so you will see like these two children, they're exploring things together and they're falling through like portals together and holes together. Um, and I feel like a lot of this also comes up when I see him act in a certain way. So sometimes he's throwing a tantrum, for example, and suddenly the things that he's saying or the way that he is upset brings a flashback to me of I'll suddenly remember myself doing the same thing as a child and how I felt. And that kind of becomes like an entry point into this memory and this emotion that was locked away before. And so he's literally helping me uncover a lot of like open up a lot of um these like memories that were locked away before. Um, but in some places you'll see just a little girl and she's just standing there alone. And she is highlighted in quite a few pieces. Um, but these moments of this child alone, they're isolated and they carry like a quiet like loneliness. And sometimes you see the figure cocooned um, in safe places, but they're they also feel horribly lonely. But then I'll always give it like some kind of like a metaphorical like silver lining, like a little bit of joy somewhere or some kind of like hook to pull yourself out of the loneliness. Um, so so that was a project that I'm currently working on. And alongside that, because I like to work on many, many, many different projects together, which is also a new thing that I started to do, which I'm really, really enjoying. Before the critical practice program, I would create one piece and then I would work on that piece until it was finished, and I would not want to do anything else. And I don't know whether it's because I took such a long break and I came back to my studio practice and I'm different as a person and I'm able to do many different projects together, or perhaps it's being a mom that's allowed me to multitask so diligently. But it is I'm actually thriving on putting away a project that is not going anywhere, or I'm just like, I don't know what to do with you right now, so put it away and then I'll work on something else. So alongside the project that I was just showing is this project that I'm working on. And this is also more similar in visually to the work that I'm currently showing at Risk. Um, so this is a series that explores that same theme of loneliness, but it's more about alone versus loneliness. Um, and in it is mixed fear and anxiety, which seem to be themes that I'm working on constantly. But again, you'll see that the visual execution is different from the previous pieces. And I think it's different because these pieces again are a different size. And so I'm really fascinated by like what's happening when I'm working on different sizes. So the larger pieces were extremely quick and there were pastels and there were no details in them. And then the smaller pieces are the Unbound book that I was just showing. They're very urgent and immediate. They're raw almost. And so these pieces that are mid-sized, 64 by 51 centimeters or roundabout, most of them, they still have like an element of looseness in them, but they're a lot more thorough, more meticulous than the others. So one of these pieces will actually take me very, very long to do because I've decided that I really enjoy doing these lines that I'll speak about in a bit. And just making the acrylic paint and the gradation of the gray for this takes me perhaps about like 7 or 8 days. Um, so yeah, so these two pieces actually are connected. And I always wanted to show them together, but I never got the chance to show them together. And now, so I'm really happy that I'm showing them like at least here together-ish, one after the other. Because you'll see like this red here and the green figure in the front. And this is what's on the other side of it. And so I the lines that I'm painting here, they speak about I think it's not too far away from landscapes, but they're more like interior scapes, places that have held us, spaces that have held us. Um, and all of these spaces are anchored by these like architectural structures. Um, so the way that I I discovered this like the grays where I was driving down like Sheikh Zayed Road one day and I looked out the window and I was like, there's so much construction happening and all these buildings and there was all this concrete. But then the buildings that were already fully done were glass and suddenly they looked very similar because the concrete was kind of gray and then the glass was kind of gray and they both have this like gray gradation from like light to dark. And so I wanted to create something that kind of emulated that. So it could be something that's very heavy. It could be something that's very fragile. It could be concrete. It could be glass. Um, but it does also, I think, lend some sort of perspective to the pieces that was really important. Um, And so I again from the same series, I became especially interested, like speaking about spaces and architecture. I am also especially interested in heterotopias. Heterotopias are these remarkable places actually that exist within our everyday spaces. So, for example, a club is a heterotopia, which is a place that defies what the norm is. So you'll have people around it, in their regular clothes and doing their regular everyday things, but then there's a door and then you enter it and then suddenly everyone is, if it's a especially crazy club, maybe you've got like feather boas and you've got, like stilettos and all of this stuff. And so there are these spaces that hold something completely different within them, a different attitude, a different way of being within them. Um, and for people who are again from, I believe maybe in the UAE also, these tents are something that I grew up with. They're called shamianas. And shamianas are used for everything in Pakistan. They're basically these cloth structures, and they can be erected absolutely anywhere. They can be erected for school functions, for school concerts, for weddings, for funerals. They can be erected in your backyard. They can be erected in your school park, in an abandoned parking lot, absolutely anywhere. And then suddenly, the meaning of that space changes. And so there'll be, and there have been many times, a huge parking lot with a shamiana erected, and that's where the wedding venue is. And so suddenly the parking lot becomes a heterotopia when it's no longer a parking lot. It suddenly becomes, it's holding all these festivities inside. And so when these tents change the meaning of the space so drastically, I often wonder if, like, once they're removed, like what happens to like all the happiness and the sadness and the wins and the losses that happened within them? Do they all stay within that area that these tents were erected in? Or like what happens, and how did they change the space that they were not supposed to be in the first place? Um, And so this is the last work. And so again, thinking about heterotopias, but then also thinking about portals, because again, I am working on these multiple projects side by side. And for me, the connections are there. Um, and so I thinking about the entrance to these heterotopias, like the windows and the doors, and how we enter into these spaces, and how they also are like portals from one world into the other. Um, and then, I mean, even outside of heterotopias, like if you just look at an apartment building, you've got these windows and these doors, and they all look alike from the outside, but then each one enters into something entirely unique, a completely separate universe. And so for me, that's where I am in my practice at the moment. Yeah, thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Sophia. What a great
You're welcome.
presentation. Thank you so much. It was really interesting to like get to know like most of your works are like personal memories, but also looking into the human body parts as portals, which is quite interesting. And the last thing that you said that, looking into these windows and they all look the same, but when you go inside, it's completely different. And I feel like also a lot of people relate to this because also when I was young, I would question like, oh, they look so similar to ours, but like I wonder what's like happening inside. Like, you
Yeah.
enter it's a completely entire different universe. So, very, very interesting. So, um, yeah, so we're open to questions to anyone who would like to ask. Sophia, you're welcome to turn on your audio, or you can also drop in a question on the chat box. Mm, okay, maybe I will ask. Uh, okay. So when we were looking into the works, like from the beginning and till the end, some of the works like the forms felt a little bit organic, while the others, seemed almost architectural. So how do these different visual language come together in your practice?
So one is the body which experiences
Mhm.
things, and the other are the things that are being experienced.
Yeah.
And so one is organic and one is in a lot, and because I am interested in spaces,
Hmm.
um, like you'll have the geography and the landscape, which is more organic, but then at the same time, a lot of memories and a lot of experiences happen in inorganic places, which are,
Yeah.
you know. within
Mm-mm.
walls.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Would you say are these interior spaces psychological, emotional, spiritual, or all three combined?
Um, I think probably all of them combined. That was really interesting because I'm actually thinking about all three things
Mm-hmm.
together
Mm-hmm.
when I make them.
Okay. Um, what else? So, looking at your practice now, what can we expect that you'll be working on next? Will you still continue to that path or you'll be exploring something different?
So I'm really into sculpture at the moment.
Okay.
And so for me, I've actually like this is something very, very new.
Mhm.
Because I've always really worked on paper.
Yeah.
And but I like form wise, medium wise, I'm thinking more sculpturally, and you'll see that
Okay.
in some of the work at the end when
Yeah.
the last work that I made. So I have been working on paper and making it three-dimensional. So I'll
Mhm.
make it into relief with through collage.
Okay.
And so I think the next step was to go more sculptural.
More
But
sculpture.
as far as like my interest in portals has not diminished at all, and I'm still
Mhm.
obsessed with spaces and places and heterotopias and portals and our access points to
Yeah.
all of these.
Okay.
So that's
And
staying for a while.
okay, we have okay, Rabia, if you have a
Thank
question.
you very much. May I?
Yes.
So this was fascinating. It was so nice to see the journey from some of your earlier work all the way to today. I wanted to ask you a little bit. I know that you started off as a printmaker and now you're working more with paint and it's fantastic to hear also about the sculpture. Can you talk a little bit about sort of these different techniques? And so if you graduated as a printmaker, what did you, so if that was what was learned, then how did you sort of move into and was it teaching yourself different kinds of techniques, etc., and how has it been, and where does printmaking now feature in the work that you do? I'll stop here.
Oh, I love printmaking. And yeah, that's what I studied both for my undergrad and grad school, and very specifically etching. So, not screen printing or lino cut, but very specifically like intaglio printing. Um, and then I just simply couldn't continue it because there were no printmaking studios. And I couldn't afford it outside of school either. And so I taught myself how, and then that's why I work on papers, because that's one thing that I cannot break is I feel like I'm betraying my printmaker self working on anything else. I love paper so, so much. And I understand paper. I know what it's doing and I know what it wants. But all the mixed media stuff, yeah, it was just self-taught. And I think mixed media because I'm not a painter. I didn't study or I didn't learn how to paint on canvas. Um, but I knew how to draw. And then the drawing, it started from drawing in very, very basic, like acrylic colors. And over the years, this is where we're at now. And printmaking, I am actually really excited because I will be after more than a decade going back into printmaking now. In about 10 days, I have a printmaking residency that I'll be at, and I'm super excited about it. Um, so yeah, I think I'll understand more of how printmaking has tied into the work once I actually pull some prints while I'm there, and then I'll see that and I'll see what happens, then I'll see the connections. So
I think Anam has a question.
Hi, yeah. I was really curious about the materiality of your work because I noticed that you were using indigo and coffee, and you said you were using a lot of organic dyes in your pieces. And obviously your work is exploring like so much about boundary and organic material and like the inner and the outside body. I was curious if you were going to be using more maybe not traditional like art supplies, like you were talking about how acrylics and store-bought paints just don't work the same way that organic material does. And that was one question I had. And then the other question was maybe in the same vein. Your Unbound book, so much of it felt like some form of self-portraiture. And if you are like using organic materials, would you be connecting that to your personal experience with each of them and going further down that road rather than using traditional paints?
Thank you. So the thing with um making my own paints and pigments, I'm not making my own pigments, I'm buying the pigments, but they are organic, and then there's the process that the pigment has to pass through, which I'm doing myself, and then using it. Um, but each time you use that pigment and each time you make your own ink, each batch is different. And I think that's also very exciting for me because it depends on like how long you boil the onion skin for, which will give you a different depth of yellow or maybe brown or a little bit of pink. It depends on what kind of onion it was. It depends on how long you keep the ink for after you make it. And so it changes. And so like that is very exciting for me. But unfortunately, the thing is that they it's like there is this very big danger for me to just go too deep into that hole of just like there are people who just solely focus on making inks and making dyes. And it's very time consuming also. And so I do need it's this fine line of like I want to know how this is done and I love the way that it happens, but I also don't want to get caught in that hole. Um, I'm an artist and I need the whole point is that I make this so that I'm able to use it on my work. And so I am using acrylics also, and I'm using gouache also. And I think all of them come together really, really well for me. So this is something that I'll definitely continue using as I progress, like later on also, but I don't think I'll ever be just doing my own inks or my own like only pigments. There are certain lovely things at acrylics, and I mean, for example, the gradation, I could never get with something that I make myself, so it has to be acrylic paint, right? So there are certain things that I need to do that can only be done by store-bought paint. Um, and what was your the things that I'm using that tie together with, and yeah, that's so interesting. I actually didn't mention this, but a lot of like the washes, yes, they're tea and they're coffee, but they're also um I don't know if anybody's familiar with potassium permanganate. In Pakistan, we call it pinky, and my mother growing up would use pinky to wash all of our fruit and vegetables in. So it basically is a disinfectant. And I decided to use a lot of that in the work. And so it dyes the paper really, really beautifully. And so that is a big nod to my childhood because that's what my mother did growing up washing fruit in this chemical. Um, I'm using things like different things that my mom used to use in cooking, like turmeric, little things that are like little personal jokes. How my brother loves beetroot, and so I've used a lot of beetroot through the work also, like boiling beetroot. Um, so yeah, hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Well, I think this should conclude the talk. Thank you so much, Sophia, again for joining us and talking about you a little bit about yourself and your work and your process. And thank you for everyone who joined us. We will be having another talk with another artist happening this Friday with Adrian Sukluna. So if you guys would like to join, we'll share the link in our socials.